Responses to the Great Transformation, the period from 1828 to 1840. Now, American society was filled with new opportunities. You had people like Chauncey Jerome that could amass a fortune in becoming a member of the genteel class, only to lose it all the next. How are people going to respond to this world? I mean, socially, you had different groups responding different ways. Some turned to a new evangelical faith that empowered the ruling of their own souls while forging close-knit groups. Others responded by violently attacking the new constraints they believed was in their lives. Others joined society bent on excising the world of its sins. And finally, others responded by trying to escape the world altogether. Economically, you had the elite and middle classes sipping their tea, reading romantic poems on the burgeoning American literature, while the working class was constrained to drink cheap whiskey, attend rowdy theater performances, or athletic competitions. Slaves, of course, faced even more constraints. But despite and in the face of such adversity, all groups created a vibrant culture. Politically, you had old-line nationalists like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster that chafed during Jackson's reign. The South starts to become more and more paranoid about states' rights. You have many more Americans becoming skeptical of all politics in general. And the Whigs try to join these disaffected groups and totally change American politics. Reaction to changing conditions. Remember, guys, more and more a person's wealth became tied to their worth. Indeed, Chauncey Jerome said, "One of the most trying things for me now is to see how I'm looked upon by the community since I lost my property. I was never any better when I owned it than I am now, and never behaved any better. But how different is the feeling towards you when your neighbors can make nothing more out of you politically or pecuniarily." That means having to do with wealth. "It makes no difference what or how much you have done for them heretofore. You're passed by without notice now. It's all money and business. Business and money which make the man nowadays. Success is everything." You have a geographical explosion, and new opportunities in business produced a highly precarious social world. People are desperate for balance. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that a lot of people turn to church. Now, the Protestant theologians had begun to struggle as to how to build a community with rising social attention and moves towards individualism. I mean, Puritans believed predestination was a key to salvation, where God chose his elect. So, can we have a different kind of view of God? Well, Nathaniel Taylor, he saw a theology that taught it was the individual that initiated salvation. Taylor's theology stated that God freely gave salvation to all who would seek it, but it was up to the individual to take hold of it. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life." That whosoever shall believeth in him. It's up to the individual. This struck a chord with a restless and expanding America. You had hundreds of preachers and lay exhorters that began spreading word of this democratic God. And by the way, the role of women in this movement was equal, if not superior, to men. Charles G. Finney sparked an intense religious revival that swept the country. He was basically a former school teacher who had a Damascus experience when he was 29 with Jesus telling him to go spread the word. And you'd have thousands in attendance at these revival meetings. Those most likely to be converted would sit on what was called the anxious bench, where they'd usually be right in front, right in center, and Finney would focus his attention on them like an attorney pleading a case. I mean, at his revival, people fainted, went in physical spasms, might cry out in hysteria, which of course gave them a lot of publicity and of course attracted a lot of copycats. And this whole Second Great Awakening, as it's called, spread like wildfire from one rural community to the next until the late 1830s, when the fire was brought to New York and Boston. I mean, these things were huge affairs. They'd begin on like a Thursday, continue on until the next Tuesday, with 10 to 25,000 people in attendance, listening to much as 40 preachers. In the evenings, the days would be filled with soul searching, Bible study, and conversation. Now, as almost always happens, this revival movement challenged existing church authority. You had new denominations that emerged, like the Presbyterians, Baptists, and Methodists split over the reactions to the new messages. And this whole multiplicity of denominations actually reinforced the belief in the separation of church and state. You know, each group was jealous of the powers of others, and as all churches depend on donations and new converts, they didn't want any other church to have the main position or support of the government. And this whole revivalism led to a new sense of Christian community, of responsibility for fellow Christians. This led to like missionary outreach efforts and to benevolent reform movements. And it also led many within the church to connect and respond to churches outside of their geographic area. Kind of like if any of y'all go to a place of worship today. You know, you might say, well, a great example is Hurricane Katrina that hit Louisiana. Just a few months before, there'd been a hurricane. Oh, well, with Katrina, the first boots on the ground helping out the people in New Orleans were churches. A lot of them from Texas that basically loaded up the beds of their trucks with water, food, other supplies. Now, not everybody blamed their misery on sin, but by their exploitation by others. And they got together and decided to do something about it. Free and slave labor protests. Now, skilled journeymen took the lead in organizing protest movements. Back in 1806, journeyman shoemakers stopped work to protest the hiring of unskilled workers to perform some of the jobs that used to be reserved to the higher paid journeymen. Now, why did they do this? Well, if you have an unskilled guy coming in and doing that, then you're not going to need as many of the higher paid journeymen. Their strike totally failed, though, when the New York court viewed the shoemakers' action as illegal. Well, the journeymen then started to form craft unions. All across the Northeast. You had like house carpenters, shoemakers, hand loom weavers, painters, comb makers. There was even a national union which enforced uniform wages and standards in the industry. They got together in 1834, formed the National Traders Union, which was the first union that represented many crafts underneath it. And in the case of Commonwealth v. Hunt, the Massachusetts Supreme Court recognized the legality of unions and strikes. And the labor protests, because you're sitting here, you're a shoemaker, and you handcraft these shoes. And there's a factory down the road that mass produces what used to be you got respect for. You were heralded. Well, now people can go out, instead of buying a pair of Doc Martens for hundreds of dollars, they can go get a pair of New Balance for $30. Well, these guys that were the skilled journeymen, they take their frustrations out by going out and beating up the immigrants that are working in the factories. If you've ever seen Gangs of New York, that's a pretty accurate depiction. The very opening, that bloody fight, is very accurate of the kind of battles that would go on. And these ethnic riots often reflected the tension between the skilled American workers and the unskilled immigrant laborers. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, most slaves, however, restricted themselves to passive resistance rather than open protests. Like it would take them a long time to get something, or they couldn't find a tool. But the most active and frightening form of slave resistance was open armed revolt. Like Nat Turner's rebellion that occurred in 1831 in Virginia. Turner was a skilled worker who knew how to make paper, gunpowder, and pottery. His purpose in raising the revolt was to free the Negro slaves. and armed with axes and scythes, the rebels started out to kill plantation owners and free the slaves. But as they were unorganized and lacked a definitive plan, they started to face defeat after defeat. And the uprising ended with the execution of Nat Turner and 20 of his followers. And following this, of course, even stricter controls and limitations were put on the slaves. Ready for the next slide? The middle class and moral reform. You had hundreds of voluntary societies that arose on behalf of many reform causes. And these organizations provided outlets for members of the new upper and middle classes. With religious idealism influencing many of these reform movements. Some good example of these were the treatment of the criminal and the insane. For the criminal, hey, we need to start having juvenile courts. We need to try to teach the prisoners a trade. So instead of having penitentiaries where people are punished, we start having reformatories where the people go in a criminal and they get reformed. They leave better than they were than when they came in. With the insane Dorothea Dix, who was an amazing lady that got a job as a reporter when women didn't have jobs as reporters. And the way she got her first job was, she says, I'm going to do an expose on this insane asylum. And so she goes in and she tells her editor that she's going to do this. And if she's not out in 6 days, that he needs to go and get her out. Anyway, she goes into an insane asylum, acts like she's insane, and they put her in with everybody else. And she found some of the inmates naked, chained to the walls. It was a place for the insane to be forgotten about. And her expose revealed a lot of that. And so they did try now to start helping and treating the insane humanely. You also had Bible societies that were begun. Sunday schools to try to make sure kids knew how to read. Sabbath rest movements, where basically nothing could be done on Sunday because it was the Lord's Day, according to Christianity. And many of these reform movements sought to impose middle-class standards of behavior on the people who took advantage of them. One such movement was in education, where Horace Mann led the movement for public schooling for children of all ages. And in addition to practical knowledge, the public schools also sought to impart Protestant religious values. And in response to the Protestant values at the public schools, that's why the Catholics broke off and started establishing their own schools. That's like why we have Jesuit, St. Rita, Cistercian, Bishop Lynch, on and on. Another such movement was temperance. Temperance basically is the belief that alcohol is bad and we had to get people to stop drinking. And it had its roots not only in religious idealism, but it was also attractive to factory owners for economic reasons. Now, why would the factory owners be concerned about it? Well, because if someone comes to work drunk, they might hurt the machines. And that's going to stop production or delay it. So we don't want that to happen. And in the cities during this time, because remember, we didn't have a lot of plumbing, especially with the poor. So you had increasing public drunkenness in the cities. Meanwhile, the middle and upper classes that don't live in the inner city but live out in the nice suburbs with the cleaner water, they're not using alcohol as much. So it's seen as, oh, that's what's keeping the poor, is that they're drinking. And also, there becomes a huge switch with the rise of abolitionism. Slavery as a moral issue began to capture national attention following the War of 1812. You had like the American Colonization Society that was established in 1816. Basically, they got $100,000 from Congress, bought their first ship, the Elizabeth, and they basically bought 88 slaves, emancipated them, and took the newly freed men back to Africa, to a place called Liberia. And that was how their system was going to work. But, guys, there's a population at this time there was a population of about 1.8 million slaves, and in the time that it took you to get those 8 from America to Africa and that ship back again, there would have been more slaves born than you had just freed. So you started having more people calling for a more radical call for the complete abolishment or abolition of slavery. Like you had the American Anti-Slavery Society, founded by William Lloyd Garrison, that advocated for an immediate abolition of slavery with no compensation whatsoever to the owners. And even though abolition is starting to become a moral issue, it was not popular at all. Well, it was popular with some people. But you had mobs that attacked abolitionists and broke up their meetings. And guys, that's in the North. They did not have these meetings in the South. Well, in this issue that's incredibly divisive and we need leadership, What is the government going to do? Well, what the government does best. They refuse to debate the issue. They're not even going to talk about it. From 1836 to 1844. And guys, silence never solves the problem. All right, towards an American culture. Romanticism and genteel culture. All right, guys, Americans imported Romanticism as a mode of thought from Europe. And leading cultural figures in America combined individualism with Romanticism, trying to emphasize the positive features of the American life and experience and the uniqueness of America. In religion, you have the combination of individualism and Romanticism, which gave rise to Transcendentalism, with Ralph Waldo Emerson really kind of forging and fashioning a lot of the ideas of Transcendentalism, of, hey, find God in nature. The way you find God might be different from the way he finds God. And that's cool, man. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, Emerson also led the way in the development of American literature. Like in The American Scholar, he called for an independence from European literary models. You know, we don't have to keep looking to Europe to see if our literature is good. Our literature is good enough. Yeah. In history, you had like George Bancroft that argued for the uniqueness of the American experience. And of course, for good old George Bancroft, he was the one, if you've heard the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, where he chopped down his dad's cherry tree and his dad came back home, "Who chopped down my cherry tree?" And little George Washington said, "I cannot tell a lie. I chopped down your cherry tree." Guys, that never happened. Well, then why do we say it? Well, we say it to show, hey, George Washington was a heck of a guy. Ready for the next slide? In visual arts, the emphasis is really put on American scenes. Like you have Thomas Cole, who started the Hudson River School. Here you can see an example of one of his paintings that basically went to the Hudson River Valley and painted the vast landscapes with the huge mountains and vibrant agriculture. Meanwhile, you also had George Caleb Bingham. This was called the Hudson River School. George Caleb Bingham, his was known as the Ash Can School, where basically he painted the common American man and made them heroes. Because, you know, it used to be people would paint like priests or judges or figures of authority like that. Well, basically Bingham and his paintings were saying the everyday American is just as good as those judges. And there's a nobility to us. Ready to go to the next slide? Culture among workers and slaves. Well, guys, as you can guess, drinking was central, even to working class theaters and sporting events. Alcoholism flourished. Now, why did it flourish? Because, guys, I am sure the groundwater wherever they lived was totally polluted. Okay, people went to the bathroom in outhouses. The waste and excrement of like horses and oxen that were in the streets, that went down into the groundwater. If they had chickens or anything like that, all of their stuff went down. Guys, basically the reason why you drank alcohol is because when you're making alcohol, you have to boil the water, which kills off all the germs, and so it was actually safer for you to drink the alcohol than it was the water. You had violence that abounded between individuals, as well as between ethnic, religious, and racial groups. Women, of course, had it even worse off than men, with single women earning less than men, and married women found themselves confined to tiny apartments and barred from activities that were available to men. Kind of a great example of this is during this time period is when the Winds, WNDS, were moving to Texas. The Winds were a culture that kind of lived on the border between Poland and Germany. And what color are most Western societies' wedding dresses? Well, most Western societies' wedding dresses are white. The Winds, they had a black wedding dress. Well, wait a minute, why'd they do that? Well, why do our brides wear white? Well, because they kind of see it as the birth of the woman, the birth of the new woman. Well, why'd the Winds wear black? Well, what do we usually wear black to? Funerals. They didn't see it as the birth of the woman, rather, they saw it as the death of the girl. Because now, as the wife, she's going to have responsibilities, limitations, etc. Now, amongst the slave communities, you had African American culture that was evolving, with the traces of the African heritage visible in the slaves' clothing, entertainment, and folkways. And family structure and religion served to preserve this way of life. Except something that was a little different in black communities, the mother was usually seen as the center of the family. Why? Well, first off, slave marriages weren't allowed on many plantations, and the father could be sold off to somebody else. But for this reason also, there was a huge outside circle of unrelated family members that were like aunts and uncles, etc. Okay, radical attempts to regain community. You had American cultural leaders and their followers reacted to excess and individualism. They'd go out and they established experimental communities like Brook Farm. Brook Farm was just one. There were hundreds of communities like Brook Farm. But basically they tried out social frontierism. Brook Farm began in April of 1841. They had about 15 other members when they started. At top, they got up to about 120, but they never had more than that at one time. Basically, all crops were owned by the community. This building right here is their schoolhouse. So you'd have to farm every day, but one day a week you might come in and teach the kids. And while everybody else was farming, then you went back to farming, and the next day somebody else came in and taught them, etc. Also, you had Robert Owen, who came in and tried to bring out communal utopianism for his workers in New Harmony, Indiana. Now, he wasn't even American. He was English. And he had built the world's largest cotton spinning factory in the world. Now, here it is, factory in Indiana. He wanted to build a model community with quality housing for his workers, a school, a day nursery for the preschool children, a playground, evening classes for the adults, and a shop that was kind of a forerunner of the co-op movement. Anyway, they get the thing started out, and of course he tells the people, hey, I want y'all to buy into this because we're all going to do this together. So a lot of wealthy people or middle class people from the East invested what they had. They moved out, and the first year the factory did great. And Robert Owen goes to him and says, okay, I can give y'all your share of the proceeds, or we can flip it back into the factory and make it even bigger and make even more money. Well, the people said, hey, let's make even more money. They start building the new factory, and then like a week before it's able to open, it burns down. Well, they still had enough left of the old factory to try to get out orders, but a week after that, the rest of the factory burns to the ground. And when that happens, basically Robert Owen says, washes his hands of it, and says, I'm out of here. Everybody got that? Well, we also have experimental religious communities. And we're going to talk about the Oneidas and the Shakers. And for both of these groups, the problem with the world is sex. Even though they were totally different about why that was a problem. For the Oneidas, basically their leader, excuse me, their leader basically said that the problem, Dr. Theodore Noyes, who is agnostic, he said the problem is everybody's always got their eye on other people. So in our group, everybody is married kind of to everybody else. And if you're with your wife and you want to be married to somebody else, basically your partner, the other person and their partner has to meet with the elders of the church, and if everybody agrees, then everybody can be switched up. And it's a complex marriage. And guys, as you can guess, this is a pretty insane way to try to run things. Their original numbers were 205. Largest group membership they got up to was 306. But then the leader dies, and his son really isn't able to keep up the complex psychological stuff that his dad did, so members start dropping off and the group fizzles out. Then we have the Shakers, and they said the problem with the world is sex, and how are they going to solve it? By not doing it. They got the name Shakers from the way they danced during their worship. As you can see, boys on this side, girls on that side. And guys, we've talked about these communities. You had like Brook Farm, which had at tops, 205 members. You had the Oneidas, which had 306 members. The Shakers had more than 200,000 people that believed in that. It was a huge growth. Well, what happened to the Shakers? How come they're not still around? Well, because guys, they were true to their faith. They didn't have sex, so their numbers don't replenish themselves. Ready to go to the next slide? Now, in this next slide, you have 3 religions that all came from a 40-mile radius in upstate New York. First is Mary Baker Eddy. She basically started the Christian Science movement. She basically believed that your health was a reflection of your relationship with God, an outward reflection of the purity of your relationship. How did she come to think that? Well, she got very sick as a child. She should have died. They prayed, and she got better. Well, then, when she was just about 20, she got sick again. Bad sick. She should have died. Prayed, she got better. So she started believing this whole health is a sign of your relationship with God. And indeed, her membership grew very big. When she died, almost nobody could believe it, which is why they paid to install a telephone in her tomb that was directly tied up to the national headquarters, so that when things got better with God and she came back, she could just give them a call and they'd release her. Now the next guy is William Miller. William Miller was a farmer, like I said, from upstate New York. He started telling people in 1831 that the biblical prophecies described in Revelation were about to transpire. And he said it would occur sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. And a lot of people believed in him and were real excited, started selling all their stuff, climbing to the tops of churches and stuff on the night of March 21st, 1844, so they'd be among the first to be taken up. But then March 22nd happened, and Jesus didn't come. So they were a little disappointed, as was Miller, until he realized that he made a mistake. He neglected to count the BC to AD rollover. So he revised the date and he said, now we have until October 22nd, 1844. And of course, he had upwards of 100,000 Millerites that had finally expected to see Jesus dressing up in white robes, selling everything they had. But then October 23rd happened. And a lot of people, according to one believer, the world made merry over the old prophet's predicament, and the taunts and jeers of the scoffers were well nigh unbearable. But Miller holds tough to his beliefs, and when he passes away, almost overnight, the remnants of his church splintered over doctrinal differences, leading to a variety of denominations, including the Jehovah's Witnesses and the modern Seventh-day Adventist Church. And finally, we have Joseph Smith, who established the Mormon Church, influenced both by religion and Romanticism. where he said that the angel Moroni delivered the tablets unto him, that basically he wrote up the Book of Mormon. That said that after Jesus ascended from Jerusalem, he came here to America and spread his word to the Native Americans. Now, one thing about his group, though, that wasn't that popular was that he believed in polygamy, that you could be married to more than just one woman. Well, his religious community went from New York to Ohio. From there, they were chased to Missouri. And from Missouri, they went to Illinois. And something big happens, but we'll talk about that later. Now, I know a lot of you guys are saying, but Professor Galloway, when are we going to talk about politics? Here we are. The Whig alternative to Jacksonian democracy. Okay. The end of old party structure. Now, the three anti-Jackson parties ran in 1832, trying to throw the election to the House of Representatives. It ends up in a big-time defeat for the anti-Jackson parties. Ready? Now, the new political coalition. Who were the anti-Jackson forces? Well, guys, they were Clay supporters, they were Southern nullifiers, anti-Masons, Christian reformers, all these things that don't really have anything that really binds them except for their hatred of Jackson. They coalesce into the Whig Party. And the Whigs were able to beat many Democrats in the 1834 congressional elections, which kind of excited them. Ready for the next slide? Van Buren in the White House. Well, once again, they try to run lots of different parties to have it thrown to the House of Representatives. Totally backfires. And Democrat Van Buren was able to win the presidency in 1836. And little did the Whigs know, but probably the best thing for the Whig Party was that they were defeated. Why? Well, let's take a look at what happened to Van Buren. Basically, the Panic of 1837, which was caused by the bank president Biddle's activities against Jackson and Jackson's Spice Circular, created a harsh depression. So Van Buren basically was beset by economic turmoil, and he only added to the problem by continuing to adhere to the strict hard money policies. In other words, we need you to pay in gold and silver. He cut government spending. Now you might think, hey, wait a minute, cutting government spending is a good thing. Maybe in the long run, but in the short run, it's going to hurt. For example, if they cut back on like food stamps. Well, if you're the store owner that was getting paid for milk for food stamps, and now not as many people are able to get milk, you're going to be hurt. The people that work for you are going to be hurt. The guy who drives the truck carrying the milk to the dairy, he's going to be hurt because less milk is going to be sold. That dairy's going to be hurt. The dairy farmer is going to be hurt. Why? Because that money isn't going into the system. Also, Van Buren established regional treasury offices. So now it's that much easier for the government to get tax money from you. Ready for the next slide? So we get into what's known as the Log Cabin and Hard Cider Campaign. The Whigs finally learn, hey, we've got to just run one candidate. So they nominate Harrison. And they so much wanted to beat Jackson that they got a Southern Democrat, Tyler, for their vice president. Why is this called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider Campaign? Well, that's because they portrayed Harrison as a common man. Because, you know, the Democrats tried to make fun of him, point out that he grew up in a log cabin. His family could only afford hard cider. And instead of running from it, he embraced it. He said, yeah, I grew up in a log cabin. Times were tough. Yeah, we only had hard cider to drink. We didn't have all that fancy champagne, not like you guys. And they also portrayed like Van Buren as an aristocrat. Now, is it effective? There's a saying that people vote for who they most likely could sit down and have a beer with. Is there any truth to that? I don't know. But I do know that the Depression truly did ruin Van Buren's chances of being elected again. So the Whigs finally get the presidency. Okay, guys, our next lecture is going to be about us heading out west. So I'm looking forward to that.